Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. Later, I'll be talking to M.J. Franklin, an editor at the Book Review, who recently wrote a profile of the author Paul Harding, who returns to publishing after a decade away with his new novel, This Other Eden. But first, libraries and their special delights and central place in our communities are the subject of a piece recently published by the Book Review, a photo project that drops in on 7 libraries across America. I'm joined by Erica Ackerberg, a photo editor here at the Times who conceived of this piece, and Elizabeth Egan, an editor on the Book Review who wrote a gorgeous essay to accompany those photos. When I was growing up in the Bronx in the 1980s, my first apartment was on 196th Street in Grand Concourse. It wasn't the best part of the Bronx. It was the 80s. It wasn't great at all. But I lived with my parents there. My grandparents lived in the building next door. And down the block from us was Poe Park. And it was so named because of Edgar Allan Poe, the great American poet and short story writer. He lived there from 1846 to 1849, which was the year of his death. And the Bronx at the time was pretty rural. It was very different. And he lived there in a cottage with his wife. And that cottage is still there. He wrote The Bells there, which is the first piece of writing in which I ever came across the word tintinnabulation, which is not a word I use very often. He wrote Annabel Lee there, which is the poem that starts, "It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea." I love that poem. I was young and I was emotional, and it was a poem about the ocean and young love and young death, and it was great. I went to the school right across the street. It was the Edgar Allan Poe School. I loved that school, and I loved Edgar Allan Poe, and I loved Poe Cottage. I was a bookish kid. And being a bookish kid, I also loved the library. My local outpost of the New York Public Library was the Fordham branch on Bainbridge Avenue, just off Fordham Road. It's since been replaced by a gleaming new building that's a few blocks away. But at the time, it was small and a little dark and a little dingy, and it was everything to me. I loved it so much. It's where I learned that, at least as it seemed to me at the time, there are endless books in the world. Now, obviously, there aren't endless books in the world. There weren't endless books in the library, but that's how it felt to me at the time. And in those books was everything that anyone would ever want to know. I still have a book that I procured at that library branch. It's The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris, who would go on to write 2 more volumes about Teddy. I'd rather not say precisely how I got this book or why I still have this book, but all I can do is ask forgiveness from the librarians who used to work at the Fordham branch. I've read the book multiple times, if that matters for anything. Libraries and their special delights and central place in our communities are the subject of a photo project that drops in on 7 libraries across America. Erica, Liz, thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert.
So, Erica, I'm going to start with you because the piece is so beautiful. It's so visual, and it's just fun to scroll through the pictures. How did you alight upon this idea, and how long has it been in the works?
A while. Liz and I started talking about this in the fall, and we wanted to do a project together, a visual project. And I was reading Celeste Ng's book, Our Missing Hearts, which the librarian is the hero of the story. So we had this idea to kind of celebrate libraries and librarians because we were also reading about budget cuts, the New York Public Library and other libraries around the country, and wanted to kind of show off all that they give to their communities.
Which libraries did you focus on, and how did you decide, of all the places, states, and cities across America, that these were the right ones?
We started with the photographers, like what photographers I could imagine having a good eye and a good storytelling skill to tell the story of a library in a different part of the country. I hired 7 photographers all around the country, one in Miami and Austin, Texas, and Oakland, California, and Seattle, and Bemidji, Minnesota, where I went to camp, and Colorado. Different photographers who have kind of different styles, and I thought would bring a different energy to documenting their local libraries.
Now, Liz, you were a big fan of Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng, but what was it about this particular idea that made you want to write about it?
I was definitely very affected by Celeste Ng's portrayal of the librarians as heroes in Our Missing Hearts. But then this summer in July, I went to visit my in-laws who live in Cleveland. Actually, they live in a suburb of Cleveland called Beechwood. And my father-in-law, who was an English teacher at a community college in Lakeland, Ohio, had retired about 2 years ago, and he became a volunteer at the Beechwood Public Library. And he brought me to the library one day this summer, and I fully expected him to be sort of the mayor of the place. He's one of those people where everywhere he goes, he meets people and he knows their names, and he's the toast of wherever he is. He's just an incredibly warm person. It really struck me when I went to his volunteer place, and he immediately went to the corner of the part of the library that he curates as a store. There's a place in the library where they sell the books that people donate, and they use the proceeds to benefit the library. And my father-in-law's job there is to keep this area organized and to keep all the donations coming in and putting them in the right place. He walked us through this area, and he was explaining to us how he does his job, and I could tell it meant so much to him. And I started paying attention to all the other people in the library, and everybody there seemed to have their own role. I mean, obviously not just the librarian, but retirees, little kids. There were even kids there who appeared to be doing homework in the summer. And it made me start thinking that once the part of your life that you do every single day for years and years and years ends, what is left for somebody like my father-in-law, and I hope for me, are the books. He goes to that library a couple times a week, not because he has a million friends there, even though I'm sure he does, but because the books are an organizing principle in his life. And so I started thinking about how books are what draw you to the library, but there are so many other things happening there that have nothing to do with books. That was around the time that we started talking about this idea that the modern library encompasses 20 other things based on the needs of its community.
One of the points of the piece, both through your essay and the wonderful photography, is really trying to combat the stereotype that we have in our mind of what a library is. As you write, Liz, silence is no longer a requirement. Versatility is. Libraries have always been a place of worship for a certain type of person, but they're also community centers, meeting houses, and pop-up medical clinics, offering vaccines, homework help, computer classes, craft sessions, tax advice. What are some of the things, Liz, that you were surprised to discover that some of the libraries that we focused on did?
Well, for instance, the Oakland Public Library in California has a seed library. It has a tool lending library. You can borrow bike repair kits from the library. They have bike repair workshops. The library in Miami, Hialeah Gardens, it's actually outside of Miami, they have a place called U Media where teenagers can go and record music and learn how to do podcasts. And one of the libraries had a weekly, I think many of them actually had a weekly senior hour where seniors can come and play music. And I discovered that my sister, who lives in Maine, regularly takes a food processor out of the library. Every time she needs to use a food processor, she checks it out of her library. There's a library of things at her library. And I realized what the library needs shows you what the community it's in is all about. And that was so interesting to me.
I assume she has to wash the food. Is it like rewind before you take the VHS back? For those of you who don't know what VHSs are, they were tapes. They have movies on them. You had to rewind them or you get a late fee. Does she have to wash it before she brings it back?
I feel like she would be bringing shame on our family if she did not wash it before bringing it back. But I think she does. And my sister's a pretty serious cook. So when she told me that, I said, maybe you should just splurge and get a food processor. But I think she likes that community vibe about the whole thing. And what you said about the VHS tapes reminds me, when we were kids, all three of us, the library was a place where you could go see a movie on a Saturday. It was really like an exciting thing. The Wizard of Oz was not on every day on your TV, but it might be on at the library. That was a huge reason why I loved the library.
I will say in my high school years, which is when I started becoming obsessed with film and old film, I was at the library all the time. Erica, when you were flipping through these photos, as any photo editor has to do, what were some of the aspects of the modern library that really stood out to you that you wanted to make sure was represented in the piece?
It was hard to edit this down because there was so much happening. Like we had a picture that didn't make the cut of people watching movies and at one of the libraries, an older couple watching movies. And there's a bookmobile in Bemidji that goes out to parking lots in northern Minnesota and kids gather and people gather and take out books there. In Austin, the public library, you could check out records, old records, and the photographer said that you could hear music around the library from people trying and playing the records. There was a senior social club in Littletown, Colorado, of this guy wearing a American flag shirt, playing music to his friends. And it really was a community. And I was actually thinking about one of the libraries, the Northtown Library in Chicago. They call themselves an intergenerational community hub. And I felt like that kind of sums up all these libraries, intergeneration, and everybody from all communities are welcome there and hang out there and spend time there. It's a warm place to be.
What's your memory of your first library?
My first library was the Southeast Minneapolis Library, and my mom took us there a lot. It was like a big trip for us. I mean, it was close by, but we went there a lot. And I remember walking in, and I would take a left to the children's room and sit right down to the bottom shelf where Flicka, Dicka, and Ricka, my favorite books, were. There was a series about these Swedish triplets, and I just read those books over and over and over. I knew exactly like how they would open and the tape on the spines, and I spent a lot of time in that little corner of the Minneapolis Public Library, the Hennepin County Southeast Library.
Is it still there? Do you know?
I think it's there. My parents have moved out since, so I haven't been there for a while, but I'm pretty sure it's still there. I can remember like they had these big stools, these big round stools that were upholstered with like itchy, colorful fabric, and I remember the feel of them in the summer. But I spent a lot of time at that library.
Liz, what's your earliest memory of going to the library?
My earliest memory of going to the library is from 1979 when my family moved from Staten Island to South Orange, New Jersey. And my mom took me and my sister to the library and made it very clear to us that when you move to a new place, that is among the first things you do. You go to the library and you get your library card. And while we were working on this piece, I was surprised by how few of my memories about the library actually involve books. So many of them involve the excitement of getting my first wallet and the only piece of ID that I had to put in it, like the only official thing that I hadn't inherited or stolen from my parents, was a library card. It grounded you in citizenship and in your town. Also, I thought so many times when we were looking at pictures of these adorable kids finding special cozy places to read in these libraries, I kept remembering the summer reading program at our library where for every book you read, you got a piece of paper that you could tie to a wire coat hanger that hung from the ceiling. And then at the end of the summer, the kid who had the most pieces of paper hanging from their mobile would get a prize. And I definitely wasn't the kid who won the prize. And I definitely wasn't a kid that the librarian knew by name, but it was just a place to go and be with other kids who loved books. And then for me, by the time I became a teenager, the library became an airtight alibi. Like you could tell your parents you were going to the library and you could be doing anything. But that building in South Orange, it was a really old brick building with a huge arched window on the front of it. And when you were old enough to go from the children's room to the adult room, you got to look out this big window onto a very nondescript parking lot. But it was a real rite of passage.
I just finished reading Matilda to my son, which I'd never read before, and he had never read before. And early in that book, Matilda makes a friend with the local librarian who discovers that Matilda lives in a household that does not care about books, and as a result, she's going to let Matilda take out whatever she wants.
Sometimes I tell my kids that I'm going to punish them to make them watch TV and not read like from Matilda.
If you don't do your homework, I'm going to make you sit in front of the TV and eat a TV dinner.
I do think that the fastest way to make your kid a reader is to make certain books the forbidden fruit, because that really worked for me.
As we wrap up here, Erica, I was wondering if you could tell me one more story about a particularly interesting library that one of your photographers visited.
Staff photographer Ruth Remsen, she lives near Seattle, and she came across this Braille library that it's this beautiful Art Deco building. And inside, there aren't that many people, but volunteers come in. There's a recording studio, and the volunteers read books out loud that are requested by patrons. And they're recorded onto these little cassette-looking things. So people can check out and request specific books for volunteers to read specific books out loud to them, for blind people to be able to listen to the audio versions that might not otherwise be available. Most of the library is like this recording studio and storage for these thousands of cassettes.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Erica and Liz, it's been such a delight to have you on today to talk about your piece, to talk about libraries. I really appreciate it. Erica, thank you so much.
Thanks, Gilbert.
Liz, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
You can read Erica and Liz's piece, A Long Overdue Love Letter to Libraries, on nytimes.com. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm now joined by MJ Franklin. MJ, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me about Paul Harding. It's a name that I think is familiar to some people. He won a Pulitzer, but it was a long time ago. We haven't seen him for a while. What's he been doing, and what's he doing now?
What's he been doing is writing, and what's he doing now is writing and probably taking a victory lap for this book, This Other Eden, which just came out this January. You may know Paul Harding because in 2010, he won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for his book, Tinkers. And he kind of came out of nowhere, actually. That was his debut novel. It was published by this small literary press, Bellevue Press. And all of a sudden, there was this new name. And not only was he a new name with a new book, he was a new name with a new book and a new Pulitzer Prize. So that was in 2010. In 2013, he had a second book, Egan, which came out. And then he's been kind of quiet for the past 10 years. And now, 10 years later, he has a new novel, This Other Eden.
Tell us a little bit about what the book is.
The book is inspired by real history. I don't want to call it historical fiction because it does take some liberties with the historical record. So I'd like to say it's literary fiction inspired by real history. It is based on real history, and that history is, in 1912, the state of Maine evicted every single person from this small island called Malaga Island, which is off of the coast of Maine. The eviction was kind of this like racially fueled displacement, and it was this big tragedy. Every single resident of this island, there were about 50 people or so is estimated, were displaced. 8 people were placed in, quote unquote, this Maine school for the feeble-minded. Structures were destroyed on the island to discourage people from coming back. And so it's this blight in American history that's been hiding in plain sight. And so Paul Harding took this story and he turned it into this tale of paradise lost. It's about a new family. In the book, it's the Honey family. And they're living on Malaga Island with a few other families. And the book tells this deceptively simple story. And that is, it's the week before everyone gets kicked off the island. It then flashes back from there and kind of dives into who these characters are. One of the characters is, quote unquote, saved by a local missionary. He's an artist and he's taken to a missionary's friend's house to get artist training. And so kind of talks about his experience off the island. And then it tells the story of what happens when that eviction tries to take place. It is quiet and very sad, but also very poetic. And it's just this really interesting literary look in this fascinating, overlooked piece of history.
What was it like to talk to the author about writing this book?
It was really fun and kind of intimidating. I'm a very big fan of Paul Harding's other books. Tinkers is one of my favorite novels of all time. And so I was just really fascinated about what his writing process is. When Tinkers came out, because he kind of burst onto the scene and not many people knew him, there were a bunch of pieces that were like, meet Paul Harding or look back on Paul Harding's journey. And when I was going to talk to him, one of the things I was interested in is not meet Paul Harding, let's look back on his journey. What I was interested in is, what is Paul Harding up to now? What is his writing process? He has such a distinctive and singular voice that I wanted to get closer to that because I think his own story and this kind of miraculous Pulitzer Prize win is a little bit known. And all of the stories kind of talking about him kind of looks back. And I wanted to look forward and I wanted to say, like, what are you trying to do? What is your goal? How do you approach literature in general? I was also just really interested in that question you asked me at the top of this segment, which is, what's he been up to for the past 10 years? Again, he's been writing, and this book has been 10 years in the oven. He drafted it and then was trying to edit it, and then his editor died and he had to find a new publishing house. And so the story behind this book is just as interesting as the story in the book, too.
Talk to me a little bit about his process. One of the things people like to hear about is what goes into writing a book. You know, you see all these pieces about what's on an author's bookshelf, what kind of pencils they use, what kind of notebooks they use. Process is endlessly fascinating to people. What's it like for Paul Harding to write a book?
The way he described his writing process was so fascinating to me because it's so open-ended. He, as an author, says he just absorbs. He called himself a magpie for ephemera at one point. He just loves to read and just collect details and kind of explore. And so when he was talking about the history of This Other Eden, the process was actually really complicated. He was on the hook for a second book after he wrote Enon because he had this 2-book contract. And he finished his book tour and he was just playing around with a scene where he was imagining some side characters from Enon. And then he was kind of imagining a painter and all of this stuff. And so he was kind of just like tinkering with the scene. And then at the same time, he's reading about organized labor movements after the Civil War. And that leads him to looking at racially integrated communities. One of the things he said is that labor movements were some of the first racially mixed movements because it was all organized around work and collaboration and all that stuff. He was looking at this landscape painter who was painting around the time of the Civil War and after the Civil War. And that led him to looking into organized labor movements after the Civil War, which led him to racially integrated communities, which is how he found Malaga. And so he's this person who's just reading and consuming and processing and then just tinkering on the page, saying what works and what doesn't work. And in the profile, we have these great photos of his writing notebooks, which you should definitely go check out because there are these books that are just scrawled with small print and they're tabbed with Post-it notes. And you get the sense that he is a collector in terms of details. And then he puts them all in this big manuscript and then the work of editing and figuring out what the story is. And he said this thing, which is that he, as a novelist, has learned that you just have to take time and let things implicate themselves. And you see the connections later on that you didn't even realize were there initially. And then you turn that into a novel.
Did you talk to him at all about what it was like for him as a white man to write this story of this mixed race community?
Yes. And he was so aware and knowledgeable of just that fact and that positioning. One of the things that he said, and this is why I was kind of hesitant to call this historical fiction at first, is I'm not telling the story of Malaga Island. I'm not telling the story of these descendants because that's not my story to tell. Instead, he was inspired by that history. And he pointed out stories of displacement, stories of community disruption for Black communities, for racially integrated communities happened at Malaga, but then also all over the United States, past and present. And so he was very aware that he wants to tell the story inspired by this. He wanted to do his own novelistic imagining inspired by this, but he was very conscious and very respectful of the fact that the experiences of the people who were displaced and the experiences of their descendants are not his. He said, and I quote, "Their lives are not mine to take up."
If you had to recommend this book to someone that you met wandering the aisles of a bookstore, let's say, what would be your two sentence, 3-sentence pitch?
Oh, that's an excellent question. My pitch would be, his books are devastating but quiet at the same time. The quality that I think of frequently is, you know, when it's snowing and it's like there's a blizzard and somehow everything feels muted and silent.
It's the best.
It's the best. And that's what reading his books are like. There are these remarkable, unforgettable stories, and yet he tells them in this way that makes you want to lean in. It makes you want to peer even closer at this calamity.
MJ, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you again for having me.
That was MJ Franklin talking about his piece on Paul Harding and his new novel, This Other Eden. And thanks again to Erica Ackerberg and Liz Egan for coming on to talk about their piece looking at libraries across America. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.